The land did not forgive. This was the first and harshest lesson the New Mexico territory taught. It was a truth baked into the cracked earth, carried on the relentless wind that tasted of grit and distance, and painted in the unforgiving glare of the sun. The sky was a vast, indifferent canvas of blue, so immense it could make a man feel like an insect crawling across a dinner plate. Mountains, the color of old bruises, jagged the horizon, standing as silent, eternal witnesses to the small, desperate struggles of men. Here, in the 1850s, life was stripped to its essentials: water, food, shelter, and the nerve to face another sunrise. For the settlers trickling in with their wagons and their weary hopes, it was a land of brutal promise. For the Navajo, the Dine, the people, it was simply Dinetta, their sacred home since the time of the first man, a place whose every rock and canyon held a story. The two worlds existed in a fragile, simmering tension, their edges rubbing against each other like flint and steel, always a breath away from a spark. Clara Mae Thompson knew the tension in her bones. It was a low hum beneath the sound of the wind, a watchfulness in the eyes of the traders at the dusty outpost of San Miguel. At 18, she still possessed the soft, rain-washed fairness of the Ohio Valley she'd left behind, a stark contrast to this sun-scoured world. Her hair, the color of pale corn silk, was a constant battle against the dust, and her blue eyes, so accustomed to gentle green hills, were often narrowed against the blinding light. She was, by all appearances, a fragile bloom transplanted into a desert, and many looked at her and saw only a thing to be withered or plucked. They did not see the steel in her spine, forged by a mother's early passing and a father's quiet reliance on her. They did not see the sharp, observant mind behind her serene expression, a mind that was learning the ways of this new world with a fierce, quiet determination. Her father, Jedediah, was a good man, a carpenter whose hands were skilled with wood but clumsy in the face of conflict. He saw the land not as a spiritual home or a place of conquest, but as a simple opportunity, a place to build a new life far from the crowded East. He loved Clara Mae with a fierce, protective tenderness that sometimes felt more like a cage. "Stay close, Clara," he'd murmur every time they made the day-long journey to the trading post, his hand resting on the old rifle by his side. "There are rough men in these parts." Today was no different. The trading post was a whirlwind of colliding cultures. Trappers in buckskin bartered pelts, their scent a mix of wood smoke and old sweat. Mexican families, vibrant in their colored serapes, sold pottery and woven blankets. A handful of U.S. soldiers, their blue uniforms powdered with dust, gambled with cards, their laughter loud and coarse. And then there were the Navajo. They moved with a liquid grace that seemed to defy the harshness of the land. They were a part of it. Clara Mae found herself watching one in particular. He was not the oldest, nor the loudest, but there was an stillness about him that drew the eye. He stood tall and lean, his body a testament to a life lived under the open sky. His dark, shoulder-length hair was held back by a simple leather band. His face, all sharp angles and planes, could have been carved from the red rock of the canyons. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple tunic, and his arms, crossed over his powerful chest, were bare save for a single silver bracelet that gleamed against his sun-darkened skin. His eyes, when they briefly swept the room, were like chips of obsidian, missing nothing. He was negotiating with the trader, his voice low and steady, speaking in a mix of his own tongue and clipped, functional Spanish. He did not haggle. He stated his terms, his gaze unwavering. And the trader, a shrewd man named Abernathy, who could fleece a pilgrim without him knowing it, nodded in agreement, his usual bluster strangely absent. The warrior gathered his goods, sacks of flour, salt, and a small crate of tinned goods with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. As he turned to leave, his eyes met Clara Mae's. It was only for a second, but the world seemed to fall silent. She felt the impact of his gaze like a physical touch, a jolt that ran from the tips of her toes to the roots of her hair. There was no warmth in his look, no curiosity, just a profound, unsettling assessment. He was looking not at her, but asterisk into asterisk her. And in that moment, she felt stripped bare of her calico dress and her civilized pretenses. She felt he could see the secret fear she harbored for this land, and worse, the flicker of fascination. She broke the gaze first, her cheeks burning, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned back to her father, pretending to inspect a bolt of cloth, her hands trembling slightly. When she dared to look again, he was gone. The journey home began in the late afternoon, the sun slanting low and painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson. The air began to cool, a small mercy after the day's heat. Their wagon, laden with supplies, creaked a rhythmic, lonely song. Jedediah hummed a tuneless hymn, a habit of his when he was content. "A good day's business," he said, smiling at her. "That new wood plane will make a world of difference. We'll have our new shelves up by Sunday." Clara May smiled back, the strange encounter at the post already fading, becoming dreamlike. The land around them was beautiful in this light, the harsh edges softened, the colors deep and rich. It was easy, in moments like this, to believe in her father's simple dream. The belief shattered when they rounded a bend of jagged rock. 3 men on horseback blocked the narrow trail. They were not trappers or soldiers. They were the kind of men her father had warned her about, their faces grimy with dirt and malice, their clothes ragged, their eyes holding the predatory gleam of coyotes. The one in the center, a big man with a tangle of a beard and yellowed teeth, grinned, showing the gaps. "Well now, look what we have here," he drawled, his voice a gravelly rasp. "A man of God and his pretty little songbird, out for a stroll." Jedediah pulled the wagon to a halt, his face paling. His hand went to the rifle. "We don't want any trouble. Just let us pass." "Oh, we'll let you pass," the man chuckled, a sound like stones grinding together. "After you've paid the toll, your rifle, your supplies, and that shiny watch I see peeking from your pocket."
"This is all we have,"
Jedediah pleaded, his voice tight. "My daughter and I." "The daughter," another of the men sneered, his gaze crawling over Clara May in a way that made her skin feel thin as paper. "She's the finest toll of all." A cold, sharp terror seized Clara May, but something else rose with it, a white-hot spike of fury. She would not be a frightened rabbit. She would not. Jedediah, seeing the look in their eyes, made a desperate move, raising the rifle. But he was no gunman. Before he could even aim, the leader had his own pistol out, the click of the hammer echoing in the sudden silence.
"I wouldn't do that, old man,"
he said softly.
"You drop that rifle,
or the little songbird loses her wings." Defeated, Jedediah let the rifle clatter to the dusty ground. The 2 other men dismounted, one grabbing the horse's bridle, the other swaggering toward the wagon. He reached for Clara May, his hand a dirty claw. "Come on down, sweetheart. Let's get a better look at you." Without thinking, Clara May reacted. As his fingers brushed her arm, she snatched up the small, heavy sack of sugar they had just bought and swung it with all her might. Connecting squarely with the side of his head, he staggered back, cursing, a look of stunned surprise on his face. The leader's grin vanished, replaced by a snarl. "Feisty. Are we? I like that." He dismounted and started toward her himself. "We'll have to teach you some manners." He lunged, grabbing her arm in a brutal grip and hauling her from the wagon seat. She landed on the hard ground, the breath knocked out of her. He loomed over her, his stench of stale whiskey and unwashed body filling her senses. "Let her go," Jedediah cried, lunging forward, only to be clubbed to his knees by the butt of another man's pistol. Clara May looked at the bearded man above her, and in her fear, she found a core of pure, unyielding defiance. She did not scream, she did not cry, She glared up at him, her blue eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it was almost a physical force. She would fight him. She would bite and claw and tear until he took her life. But she would not submit. It was in that moment, in that tableau of ugly desperation, that he appeared. He moved not from the road, but from the rocks above, a silent, swift shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the canyon. The bandits didn't even see him until he was among them. The first was dispatched with a brutal, non-lethal efficiency, a hard blow to the throat that sent him gasping to the ground. The second turned, his eyes wide, and found the cold, hard barrel of Jedediah's rifle pressed against his forehead. Now wielded by the Navajo warrior, he froze, dropping his own weapon as if it were a hot coal. The leader, still holding Clara May, spun around, pulling her in front of him as a shield. He pressed his pistol to her temple. One more move, Injun, and she's gone. The warrior stood motionless, the rifle steady in his hands. It was the man from the trading post, Nalnish. His obsidian eyes were fixed on the bandit, but Clara May knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that his awareness was entirely on her. He saw her terror, and he saw the unbroken fire beneath it. "Let the woman go," Nalnish said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the evening air with the edge of a honed blade. It held no room for negotiation. It was a command. "Not a chance," the bandit snarled, his arm tightening around Clara May. "You drop the gun, or—" He never finished. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur. Nalnish shifted his aim slightly and fired. The bullet didn't strike the bandit's head or chest. It struck his hand, shattering the bone and sending the pistol flying. The man howled, a sound of pure agony and shock, stumbling back and clutching his ruined hand, his hold on Clara May broken. Nalnish did not fire again. He simply walked forward, his presence more menacing than any bullet. The remaining two bandits, seeing their leader writhing on the ground, scrambled for their horses and fled into the twilight, abandoning their comrade without a second thought. The warrior stood over the whimpering, injured man. He looked down at him with an expression of cold contempt, then kicked the fallen pistol far into the sagebrush. "Your life is not worth the powder," he said, his voice flat. He then turned his back on him, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. The man, cradling his bloody hand, staggered to his horse and rode away, sobbing in pain. Silence descended, broken only by Jedediah's shaky breaths as he climbed to his feet. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Nalnish's attention was now solely on Clara May. He walked to where she stood, trembling in the aftermath of the assault. He stopped a few feet from her. His gaze was just as intense as it had been in the trading post, but now it held something else. It was not pity. It was something deeper, a kind of elemental recognition. He looked at her, at the dust on her dress, the wildness in her eyes, the proud, unbroken set of her shoulders. He saw the girl who had fought back with a sack of sugar. Jedediah stammered, "Sir, we are in your debt. I don't know how to thank you. We have little money, but—" Nalnish did not seem to hear him. His eyes never left Clara May. The sun was now a fiery sliver on the horizon, bathing them all in a blood-red light. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of dust and juniper. He finally spoke, his English formal and precise. He did not speak to Jedediah, nor did he speak directly to Clara May. He spoke to the sky, to the land, to the spirits that dwelled in the deepening twilight. It was not a request or a proposal. It was a declaration, an oath sworn before the ancient, silent witnesses of the earth. "The spirit of a warrior lives in her," he said, his voice resonating with an unshakable certainty. "She will not be broken by this land. She will be protected. She will be honored." He then turned his gaze fully on the stunned Jedediah, and his final words fell into the quiet air with the weight of carved stone, an irrevocable claim that bound their fates together in that fiery moment of sunset. She will be my wife. Nalnish did not follow them. He melted back into the rocks from which he had come, leaving Jedediah and Clara May alone in the ringing silence of the canyon. The journey home was a spectral procession, the creak of the wagon wheels unnaturally loud in the twilight. Jedediah's hands trembled on the reins, his face a pale mask of shock and gratitude that was slowly hardening into fear. He did not speak of what had happened, of the warrior's declaration. He couldn't seem to find the words. It was too large, too foreign. A boulder dropped into the placid pond of his simple life. Clara May sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket and a silence of her own. Her body still shook with the lingering tremors of the attack, but her mind was a maelstrom. She kept seeing the warrior's eyes, as dark and ancient as the night sky. Asterisk, she will be my wife. The words echoed not with the heat of passion, but with the cool, unshakable finality of a mountain. It was not a proposal to be accepted or denied. It had been stated as a fact, a truth the land itself had witnessed. She felt a terror so profound it was almost dizzying, yet beneath it, shamefully, stubbornly, there was another feeling, a flicker of awed safety she had never known. Their cabin, when they finally reached it, felt small and fragile under the vast, star-dusted canopy. For the next 3 days, an unspoken dread settled over their home. Jedediah worked with a frantic energy, hammering and sawing, filling the air with the sounds of civilization as if to ward off the wilderness and the warrior's claim. He spoke of moving on, of California, of anywhere but this place where the world did not operate by the rules he understood. Clara May moved through her chores in a daze, her senses heightened. Every snap of a twig, every shadow thrown by a passing cloud, made her heart leap. She was afraid he would come, and even more afraid that he would not. The world had split into 2 distinct periods, the time before his vow, and the time after. He came on the morning of the 4th day. There was no sound of a horse, no call from the trail. Clara May was hanging laundry on a line when she felt a shift in the air, a stillness that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She turned, and he was there, standing at the edge of the cleared land near the juniper trees, not 20 yards away. He was not armed for war, carrying only a longbow and a quiver of arrows. Slung over his shoulder was a freshly killed doe. Jedediah came out of the cabin, a half-finished chair leg in his hand, his face grim. "What do you want here?" he demanded, his voice tight with a fear he was trying to pass off as anger. Nalnish did not look at Jedediah. His eyes were on Clara May. He walked forward slowly, laid the doe respectfully on the ground near their woodpile, and then straightened to face her father. "I have made my word known," Nalnish said, his voice calm and even. "I come to speak with you, man to man." "There is nothing to speak about," Jedediah retorted, taking a step forward. "My daughter is not, she is not for you. We are different people. Our worlds are not the same. It would not be right." He was pleading now, his arguments flimsy against the warrior's solid presence. The folks in town, they wouldn't understand. It would bring shame on her. Nalnish listened with an unreadable patience. When Jedediah finished, a muscle worked in his jaw. "Your town's shame is a whisper in the wind. My honor is stone. I saved her life. My protection is my claim. She will have food when the land is barren. She will have water when the streams run dry. She will be safe from the men who prowl in the shadows. This is my promise. It is more than the whispers of frightened men can offer." He was not bragging. He was stating facts, his credentials as a man in this unforgiving land. He was a warrior, and his reputation, his ability to survive and protect, was his currency. Clara May found her voice, surprising both men. "Father," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "he did save us. We owe him the courtesy of listening." Jedediah looked at his daughter, his face a canvas of disbelief and betrayal. But Nalnish turned his head slightly, his obsidian eyes meeting Clara's for a moment. In his gaze, She saw a flicker of something that might have been approval. He had known she possessed a core of strength, and she had just proven him right. The meeting was a stalemate. Jedediah would not give his blessing, and Nalnish would not retract his vow. He left as quietly as he had arrived, leaving the deer behind. That night, for the first time, they ate venison roasted over their fire, the meat a tangible symbol of his promise, a silent argument in a debate where words had failed. Life fell into a new, strange rhythm. Nalnish did not come to their cabin again, but his presence was a constant, sometimes, while drawing water from the well. Clara May would see him, a lone, still figure on a distant ridge, watching. He was not spying. He was guarding, a silent, self-appointed sentinel. When a pair of hungry coyotes got too close to their single goat, a flint-tipped arrow appeared in the dirt before them, and they scattered into the brush. When Jedediah's axe handle split, a new one, perfectly carved from strong, supple mesquite, was left leaning against the woodpile the next morning. These gestures were a language Clara May was slowly beginning to understand. He was not trying to win her with trinkets or sweet words, but by demonstrating his worth in the only way that truly mattered here: competence, strength, and unwavering reliability. Her fear of him began to recede, replaced by a deep and unsettling curiosity. She wondered about his people, his beliefs, the world he saw when he looked out at the same landscape that so often intimidated her. The land itself seemed determined to test them. The dry heat of late summer intensified. The creek they relied on for water slowed to a muddy trickle. The air grew thick and heavy, and the sky took on a sickly yellow-brown haze. An old trapper passing through warned them. "Sandstorm's comin'," he'd grunted, spitting tobacco juice. "Sky gets that color. The devil's beaten his wife. Batten down." They did their best, securing the shutters and packing rags into the cracks around the doorframe. But they were Ohio Valley folk. They understood floods and snow, not a storm made of earth and wind. It hit at dusk, a low moan that grew into a deafening roar. The world outside their cabin disappeared into a swirling vortex of sand. It was a physical assault, the wind screaming like a banshee, hurling grit against the windows with the force of buckshot. Sand found its way through every tiny crack, coating their tongues, getting in their eyes, covering every surface in a fine, gritty film. Their goat bleated in terror from its small lean-to. Then came a sound that chilled them to the bone, a loud crack, followed by the groaning tear of wood. A section of the roof over their small porch had been ripped away by the wind. The well Jedediah shouted over the din. "If it gets filled with sand, we're finished." They fought their way outside into the maelstrom, their heads down, handkerchiefs tied over their faces. The force of the wind was staggering, trying to tear them from their feet. They struggled to pull the heavy wooden cover over the well, but the storm fought them at every turn, the cover acting like a sail. It was in the midst of this chaos, a moment of pure, blinding panic, that a figure emerged from the brown gloom. It was Nalnish. He moved with his head bowed, his body angled against the wind, a man not fighting the storm but moving within it, understanding its power. He didn't speak. He simply put his shoulder to the well cover with theirs, and with his added strength, they finally wrestled it into place and dropped the heavy locking bar. He then moved to the damaged lean-to, using his own body to shield the terrified goat while he quickly, expertly, secured the remaining roof planks with rope he produced from a pouch. He worked with a calm, focused intensity that was the very antithesis of the storm's fury. When the worst was done, they stumbled back into the cabin, shutting the door against the howling world. They were all covered in a thick layer of dust, exhausted and breathing heavily. The tiny cabin felt like a ship's hold in a hurricane. For a long while, no one spoke. The storm raged outside, a reminder of their shared vulnerability. Clara May lit the lantern, its soft glow pushing back the shadows. In the flickering light, she looked at Nalnish. His face was streaked with dirt, his hair wild, but his eyes were calm. He was not a savior from another world. He was a man of this asterisk world, one who knew its rages and how to endure them. When the wind finally began to die down hours later, leaving an eerie silence in its wake, Clara May moved to the hearth. Without a word, she began to build a fire, her hands moving with a newfound purpose. She prepared a simple meal of corn cakes and the last of the salted bacon. They ate in silence, the three of them huddled around the small stone fireplace. The fire was a living thing in the center of the room. It crackled and danced, casting a warm, comforting glow. It pushed back the chill that had settled deep into their bones. Yet it was also a boundary. Clara May and her father sat on one side of the hearth, on their simple wooden stools. Nalnish sat on the other, on the floor, his back straight, comfortable in his own skin. The fire was the space between their two worlds, a source of shared warmth, but a clear line of division. Clara May finally broke the silence. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft. "Why do you watch over us?" Nalnish looked from the flames to her face. "I made my word known," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "But you don't know me," she persisted, a desperate need to understand welling up inside her. "I know your spirit," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "I saw it when you faced the men on the trail. It is strong. It does not break. A spirit like that must not be left to the mercy of the wind." Jedediah shifted uncomfortably, but he remained silent. He had seen what Nalnish could do, what he understood. His arguments about society and shame felt thin and hollow in the face of the storm they had just survived. Clara May watched the Navajo warrior across the flickering flames. The light softened the harsh angles of his face, revealing a depth and a stillness that she had mistaken for coldness. He was so utterly different, his beliefs and customs a mystery to her. She was still afraid, not of him, but of what he represented, a leap into a world she could not possibly comprehend. Yet, as she sat there, safe and warm, while the wind-battered world outside settled into a new, sand-swept shape, she felt the first true thaw in her heart. The fear was still there, but it was now intertwined with a powerful, growing thread of respect, and something more, a slow burning, terrifying, an undeniable pull toward the man on the other side of the fire. The storm passed, leaving the world scoured clean and glistening under a benevolent sun. It had changed the landscape, carving new rivulets in the dry earth and stripping the leaves from the cottonwood trees. It had also changed the landscape of their small, isolated life. Jedediah's open hostility toward Nalnish had been washed away, replaced by a grudging, silent respect. Fear remained, but it was now the fear of a father seeing his daughter drift away on a current too strong for him to fight. Nalnish began what the settlers would have called a courtship. Though it bore no resemblance to the parlor visits and stolen glances Clara May had read about in worn-out novels, his was a courtship of the land itself. It was a practical, silent instruction in the art of survival, an unfolding of the desert's secrets, one by one. He did not bring her flowers. He showed her where to find the deep-rooted plants whose leaves, when crushed, could soothe a burn or draw out a fever. He did not write her poems. He taught her the poetry of the earth, how to read the story of a passing coyote in the dust, how to know the direction of the wind from the lean of the juniper trees. Their classroom was the vast, open country. Jedediah would watch from the cabin, his carpentry forgotten, as Nalnish led his daughter out into the wilderness that had once been her greatest fear. He saw them kneeling together, their heads bent over a set of tracks. He saw Nalnish point to the sky, explaining the flight patterns of a hawk. He saw Clara May, who had once flinched at the sight of a snake, learn to walk with a quiet, steady confidence, her eyes no longer on the ground in front of her, but scanning the horizon, reading the world as he did. During these lessons, a new language formed between them, one of touches as fleeting and significant as a raindrop in the dust. while showing her how to find water. He would guide her hand to the base of a plant, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. The contact was brief, functional, yet it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the desert heat. While teaching her to fletch an arrow, a skill he insisted she learn. For a woman who can provide for herself is a queen in her own right. His hands would cover hers to correct the angle, his warmth seeping into her skin, his proximity making it difficult to breathe. Each touch was a spark, and each shared glance a slow-burning ember. She began to see past the harsh warrior. She saw the patience in his eyes as she fumbled with a knot he had shown her 3 times. She heard the quiet humor in his voice when a rabbit she was stalking easily outsmarted her. She learned that his silence was not an absence of feeling, but a deep well of observation. He, in turn, began to learn from her. He watched, fascinated, as she tended her small, struggling garden, marveling at her persistence in coaxing life from the unforgiving soil. He tasted the bread she baked in her small stone oven and found it strange but satisfying. He would listen as she hummed the soft, simple hymns of her people, melodies that spoke of a faith so different from his own, yet filled with a similar yearning for meaning. He learned that her world was one of quiet rituals, of small comforts wrested from the wilderness, of a gentle order imposed upon the chaos. He saw that her strength was not just in defiance, but in her enduring grace. Yet, as their connection deepened, so did Clara May's inner turmoil. The society she came from had clear, rigid rules for women. A wife was her husband's helpmate, his property, her will subsumed by his. The idea of marriage had always felt to her like the closing of a door. She feared it, feared the loss of the quiet independence she cherished. To marry this man, a man from a world so completely alien, was not just the closing of a door, but a leap from a cliff into an unknown abyss. Could she do it? Could she abandon everything she had ever been taught? The love blooming in her heart felt like a betrayal of her own identity, a wild, dangerous weed in the carefully tended garden of her life. Nalnish, too, was fighting his own battle. The instinct of a warrior was to claim, to protect what was his. Every time he saw her, the urge to simply lift her onto his horse and take her to the safety of his people's camp was a primal fire in his blood. He desired her not just for her spirit, but for the curve of her neck when she tilted her head, for the way the sun caught the gold in her hair, for the scent of lavender and wood smoke that clung to her. But his vow had been one of honor, of respect. The very spirit he admired in her was one that could not be caged. To force her would be to break the thing he held sacred. And so he waged a war within himself, banking the fires of his impatience, tempering the steel of his will with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. He had to court not just the woman, but her trust. The tipping point came on a night when the moon was a perfect silver disk in a sea of ink-black sky. It hung so bright and close it seemed one could reach up and touch it, its light bathing the landscape in a soft, ethereal glow that smoothed away all the harsh edges of the day. They had shared a meal of roasted rabbit and corn cakes. Jedediah, seeing the intensity of the unspoken thing between them, had retreated into the cabin with a muttered excuse about mending a harness, leaving them alone by the fire. The flames had died down to a bed of pulsing orange coals, and the world was utterly still, wrapped in the cool, silent embrace of the desert night. Under the moon's gentle watch, Clara May felt a surge of courage. She had to know. She had to understand. "Nalnish," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "In my world, a woman, when she marries, belongs to her husband. She is his to command." She couldn't bring herself to look at him, staring instead into the glowing embers. "I am not a person who commands easily." Nalnish was silent for a long moment, watching her, the moonlight carving his profile into a stark relief of shadow and silver. When he spoke, his voice was low, softer than she had ever heard it. "The Dine see this differently," he said. "A man does not own a woman. He does not own the land. He does not own the sky. We are all children of the changing woman, placed here to walk in beauty. He shifted, turning to face her more directly. A husband and wife are not master and servant. They are Ho-Ho balance. He is the mountain, strong and unmoving, a shield against the storm. She is the river that flows at its base, giving life, making the land rich. The mountain is barren without the river. The river is lost without the mountain to guide its path. He paused, his dark eyes searching hers in the dim light. Your spirit is a great river. Clara May. I do not wish to command it. I wish to be the mountain that allows it to flow safely. The breath caught in her throat. His words were a balm on the deepest fears of her soul. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a possession to be claimed, but as a force to be honored. The fear that had been her constant companion for weeks finally began to recede, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. Unconsciously, she reached a hand out, her fingers brushing the back of his hand where it rested on his knee. It was not an accident this time. It was a question, a plea, a surrender. He turned his hand over and slowly, deliberately, laced his fingers with hers. His touch was warm and strong, a solid anchor in her swirling sea of emotions. They sat like that for a timeless moment, their hands clasped, the only two people in a world washed in silver and shadow. The dance of their courtship, the steps forward and back, had led them to this point of quiet, profound connection. Later that night, as she lay in her narrow bed, the moonlight streamed through her window, a silent, white ribbon on the rough wooden floor. Nalnish's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, he is the mountain. She is the river. It was a beautiful, terrifying vision of a life she could never have imagined. Her heart ached with a love so new and fierce it felt like a wound, but the world was larger than the two of them. The whispers of San Miguel, the scornful looks, the judgment of her own people. They were out there, a storm gathering just beyond the moonlit horizon. And miles away, Nalnish sat by the embers of his own solitary fire, staring up at the same moon. He could still feel the impossible softness of her hand in his. The warrior in him was satisfied. The claim had been acknowledged. But the man was in torment. He knew that to truly be her mountain, he would have to stand against not just the physical dangers of the desert, but the far more treacherous landscape of hatred and prejudice that lay between their two worlds. The moon, in its serene, untouched innocence, seemed to mock him, for it illuminated the path ahead, a path he knew was fraught with a conflict that would demand more than just his strength, but all of his honor and all of his heart. The decision was not spoken aloud. It was sealed in the clasp of their hands under the silver light of the moon. It was a truth that now existed between them, as solid and real as the mountains on the horizon. The next morning, when Nalnish came to the cabin, there was no more talk of lessons or courtship. He and Clara May stood together as they faced her father, and Jedediah, seeing the unshakable resolve in his daughter's eyes, finally crumbled. His shoulders, which had been squared in defiance for so long, slumped in weary defeat. His fight was over. He would not give his blessing with joy, but he would not stand in the way of her life. Word of the impending union spread through the territory on the wind, a strange and unsettling rumor that caused brows to furrow in San Miguel and heads to shake in the Navajo camps. It was an unnatural thing, a disruption to the fragile order of their separate worlds. Preparations for the wedding began, each detail a negotiation between two cultures that had only ever met at the point of a gun or across a trader's counter. Jedediah, clinging to the last vestiges of his world, insisted on a preacher. He sent a message with a passing trapper, and a week later, a thin, sallow-faced man named Reverend Miller arrived, his Bible clutched in his hand like a shield against the wilderness. He looked at Clara May with eyes full of pity, as if she were a lamb being led to a strange and heathen sacrifice. Clara May worked with trembling hands to fashion a wedding dress. It was not the white lace and silk of her girlhood dreams, but a simple frock of pale blue calico. The best cloth she owned. It was the dress of a pioneer woman, practical and sturdy. Yet she sewed a line of small, dried desert flowers along the collar, a quiet nod to the world she was about to enter. Nyalnish prepared for the ceremony according to the ways of the Dine. The location he chose was a sacred place, a wide, shallow alcove carved by ancient winds into the base of a towering red rock mesa. The stone walls would amplify their words, and the open sky would be their witness. He arranged for his uncle, Hosteen Yazi, a respected Hataliyi, or singer of ceremonies, to come and offer the proper blessings. He was building a bridge, beam by painstaking beam, across the chasm that separated them. The wedding day dawned clear and hot. The sky was a searing, cloudless blue. Two separate groups of people converged on the rock alcove, approaching from opposite directions and keeping a careful distance, like wary wolves circling a fresh kill. From the east came the settlers. There were few of them. Jedediah, his face ashen, his Sunday suit looking stiff and out of place. The trader Abernathy and his wife, their faces masks of morbid curiosity. And Reverend Miller, who stood sweating in his black wool coat, his expression grim. They huddled together, a small island of civilization in a vast, wild sea. From the west, on foot and on horseback, came the Navajo. There were more of them, perhaps 20 in all. They were Nalnish's kin, his clan. His mother was there, a woman of immense dignity, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes holding a deep, sorrowful wisdom. There were his cousins and his uncle, Hosteen Yazi. And there was Kia, a young warrior whose skill was nearly a match for Nalnish's. He stood with his arms crossed, his handsome face set in a scowl of disapproval. To him, this union was a watering down of the blood, a concession to the invaders, a betrayal. When Nalnish arrived, he wore not the simple leggings of a hunter, but the ceremonial dress of a Dine man. A fine woven blanket was draped over his shoulders, and a single eagle feather was tied in his dark hair. He was not just a man. He was the embodiment of his people's pride and tradition. He went first to the settlers' side, to Jedediah. He stopped before the older man and gave a slight, respectful bow of his head. "I have come for your daughter," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Jedediah swallowed hard, his throat working. He could only nod as he brought Clara May forward. She looked impossibly fragile and beautiful in her simple blue dress. She took Nalnish's offered hand, her small, pale fingers disappearing into his strong, sun-darkened grasp. Together, they walked to the center of the alcove, positioning themselves directly between the two wary factions. The ceremony began with Reverend Miller stepping forward, his voice thin and reedy against the immense backdrop of the red rocks. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." His words, which would have been a comfort in a small wooden church in Ohio, seemed alien and hollow here. He spoke of Adam and Eve, of a wife's submission to her husband, of a God who lived in a heaven far above this red earth. Nalnish stood with stoic patience, his gaze fixed on Clara May, honoring this part of the ritual for her sake. Clara May listened to the familiar words, feeling a pang of grief for the world she was leaving behind. When the preacher finished his part, he stepped back, looking flustered and uncertain. Now, Hosteen Yazi came forward. He was an old man, bent with age, but his eyes were as bright and sharp as a hawk's. He began to chant, his voice a low, rhythmic song in the Dine language, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. He spoke of the first man and the first woman, of the sacred mountains, and of walking the pollen path of beauty. He took a small, intricately woven basket and, using a gourd dipper, sprinkled water to the 4 sacred directions. Then he took a pinch of yellow corn pollen and blessed the couple, touching it to their heads and shoulders, a symbol of life, fertility, and happiness. The two ceremonies could not have been more different, one of words sent up to a distant sky god, the other of ritual that drew its power from the living earth beneath their feet. The air was thick with the tension of this impossible union, with the weight of hundreds of years of misunderstanding and conflict pressing in on them. Then came the moment for their own words. The chants and prayers fell silent. The only sound was the sigh of the wind as it moved through the canyon. They turned to face each other, oblivious to the dozens of critical eyes upon them. Nalnish looked at Clara May, and in that moment, she was the only person in the world. He saw not a white woman, not a settler, but the fierce, beautiful spirit he had vowed to protect. He spoke, and his voice, which could be as hard as stone, was now filled with a deep, resonant reverence. I stand before you not as a warrior, but as a man who has seen the spirit of the river in you, and the strength of the mountain, he said, his English slow and deliberate, for all to hear. I swear to protect you as I protect the Mother Earth, who gives us life. I swear to honor you as I honor the spirits of my ancestors, who guide my path. My home will be your home. My people will be your people. My heart, he paused, his gaze intensifying, is the shield I place before you for all our days. A tear escaped Clara May's eye and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. The sheer, profound weight of his oath settled over her, a sacred blanket of safety and love. Now it was her turn. She looked at him, at his proud, beloved face, and she spoke from the very core of her being. Her voice was choked with emotion, a trembling whisper that carried in the stillness of the canyon. I came to this land a stranger, and I was afraid, she began. Her eyes locked on his. You taught me to see its beauty, and you have silenced my fear. She took a shaky breath, her heart overflowing. I am yours. I have never known another love but you. Her words, so simple and direct, hung in the air. To the settlers, they sounded like the tragic, naive confession of a captured girl. To Kia and the other skeptical Navajo, they were a puzzling, absolute pledge of fealty. But to Nalnish, they were the purest gift she could offer her whole heart, her complete and utter trust, a soul as untouched and true as the morning sun. He lifted a hand and gently wiped the tear from her cheek with his thumb. In that single, tender gesture, the wedding was sealed. There was no celebration. As the ceremony concluded, an awkward, heavy silence fell. The two groups did not mix. Abernathy's wife gave Clara a look that was a toxic blend of pity and morbid fascination. Kia approached Nalnish, spoke a few sharp words in Daini, and then turned and walked away, his disapproval a palpable force, one by one. Both groups began to disperse, melting back into the landscapes from which they had come, leaving the newlyweds standing in the long shadows of the late afternoon. Finally, only Jedediah remained. He walked to his daughter and pulled her into a fierce, desperate hug. Be happy. Clara May, he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. That's all I ever wanted. He squeezed her one last time, then turned and walked toward his wagon without looking back, a lonely figure leaving his greatest treasure behind in the wilderness. They were alone. The sun was dipping below the mesa, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The air grew cool. Nalnish took her hand. It was done. They were husband and wife, bound by promises made in two languages, under the watch of two worlds. He said nothing, simply leading her away from the sacred alcove, toward a small, newly built hogan that stood alone, facing the east, ready to greet their first dawn together. The solemnity was over. The tension of the ceremony was fading, only to be replaced by a new, more intimate, and far more terrifying uncertainty. The silence of the wedding night. The walk to the hogan was the longest of Clara May's life. The sun had completely vanished, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple that bled into black at the zenith. The silence between them was no longer the comfortable quiet of their lessons in the wilderness. It was a fragile, crystalline thing, charged with the unspoken weight of the night to come. Every step she took beside her new husband was a step further away from the girl she had been, and a step deeper into a terrifying, exhilarating unknown. The hogan was a dark, solid shape against the star-dusted horizon. It smelled of fresh pinon pine and damp earth, a scent that was both alien and deeply comforting. Nalnish pulled back the heavy blanket that served as a door and held it for her. Stepping over the threshold felt like crossing a boundary into another life. Inside, it was a single, circular room, larger than it appeared from the outside. The space was simple, clean, and sacred. A fire pit lay in the center, directly beneath a smoke hole in the roof that offered a perfect, dark blue circle of sky. Soft sheepskins were laid neatly upon a raised section of the earth, forming a bed. A few clay pots and woven baskets were the only other furnishings. This was his home, her home. The thought was so immense it made her dizzy. Without a word, Nalnish moved to the fire pit. He knelt with the fluid grace she knew so well and, with a flint and steel, coaxed a small flame to life. The kindling caught, and soon a gentle fire was crackling, pushing back the shadows and painting the curved walls in flickering shades of orange and gold. The warmth began to fill the small space, but it did nothing to quell the chill that had settled deep in Clara May's bones. She stood by the door, her hands clenched at her sides, her wedding dress feeling like a costume she was no longer entitled to wear. This was it, the moment her life as a girl ended and her life as a wife began. Her mind was a chaotic jumble of her father's sorrowful face, the preacher's solemn warnings about wifely duties, and the crude, whispered jokes she had once overheard between farmhands at a market fair. She had been raised to believe that this part of marriage was a woman's burden, a secret, shameful trial to be endured for the sake of her husband and the hope of children. It was a dark, frightening mystery, and she was utterly, hopelessly unprepared. Nalnish finished with the fire and rose, turning to face her, in the soft, dancing light. His features were less harsh, his eyes deep pools of shadow. He looked at her, his wife, and his gaze held a quiet, possessive warmth she had never seen before. It was the look of a man who had finally brought his most precious possession home. He had fought for her. He had vowed to protect her. And now the time had come to make her truly his. He took a slow step toward her, his intention clear in the gentle reverence of his expression. This was the moment. He expected her to come to him. He expected a bride. And her body, her treacherous, terrified body, betrayed her. As he reached a hand out to touch her face, she flinched. It was a small, involuntary movement, a recoiling so slight it was barely perceptible. But in the charged silence of the hogan, it was as loud as a gunshot. His hand stopped, hovering in the air between them. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of confusion, then concern. He lowered his hand and his voice was soft, so it would not break the fragile quiet. "Clara May, are you afraid?" She couldn't speak. She could only nod, her throat tight with a knot of unshed tears. She was ashamed of her fear, ashamed of her weakness. After all his patience, all his honor, was this how she would greet him on their wedding night, as a frightened child? "Of me?" he asked, a hint of pain in his voice. "No," she finally managed to whisper, the word tearing from her. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "Never of you. I am afraid of this." She gestured vaguely at the sheepskin bed, at the intimacy of the small, enclosed space. "I do not know what is expected. I do not know how to be a wife." The confession hung in the air between them. Nalnish's brow furrowed. He did not understand. He had taken a wife. She had come to him willingly. The path ahead was as natural and clear as the rising of the sun. Seeing his confusion, her desperation grew. The dam of her restraint finally broke, and the words tumbled out in a torrent of whispered, Shame-faced honesty. The preachers, the older women, they speak of a wife's duty, a debt she owes her husband. They speak of it in hushed voices, as something painful, a cross to be borne. Her voice trembled, thick with tears. I am so ignorant. Nalnish, my mother died before she could tell me of these things. I know nothing. I am afraid I will fail you, that I will displease you. She finally finished, her gaze falling to the earthen floor, her entire body trembling with the force of her confession. She stood before him, stripped bare not of her clothes, but of all her pride and pretense. She was not the defiant girl who had faced down bandits, nor the strong woman who had learned the ways of the desert. In that moment, she was only a frightened, innocent soul, terrified by the weight of a world's worth of shame and ignorance. Nalnish stood as still as a stone. He listened to her broken words, and a profound, world-altering understanding began to dawn within him. He had seen her spirit, her fire. He had assumed that a woman so strong, who had lived in the settler's world, would understand the ways between a man and a woman. But as he looked at her now, trembling and afraid, he saw the truth. He saw past the courage to the core of her being, a place of stunning, untouched innocence. Her vow at the wedding echoed in his mind, and I have never known another love but you. He had heard it as a pledge of loyalty. He now understood it as a literal, fundamental truth. She knew nothing of love, nothing of men. Her fear was not of him, but of a phantom, a story of pain and duty told by a frightened, joyless people. He had claimed her as his wife, believing he was taking a woman. He now saw that he had been entrusted with the heart of a girl on the very cusp of womanhood, a heart that had been taught to fear the very thing that should bring it joy. A great, silent thought, the culmination of their entire story, settled in his mind with the weight of destiny. A Navajo warrior claimed her as wife, yet on their wedding night, he discovered her untouched innocence. In that moment, he realized his vow of protection had taken on a new, deeper meaning. The victory was not in the claiming of her body. The victory, the true honor, was in being worthy of the absolute trust she had just shown him. His desire for her, the primal fire that had burned in him for weeks, did not vanish. Instead, it was transformed, purified by a wave of tenderness so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He did not step forward. He took a deliberate step back, giving her the space she so desperately needed. The confusion was gone from his face, replaced by an expression of infinite patience and a gentleness she had never seen. He walked back to the fire and sat, cross-legged, on the far side of it. He motioned for her to sit as well, on the opposite side. The fire, which had once been the barrier between their two worlds, now became their hearth, a place of shared, safe warmth. There is no debt. Clara may, he said, his voice a low, soothing murmur, like the river running over smooth stones. There is no duty, not in my world. A man does not take from his wife what she does not offer freely. That is not the path of beauty. He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, abiding respect. What is shared between a husband and a wife is not a cross to be borne. It is a gift, a ceremony. It is meant to be a joy, not a fear. Your people have taught you to be afraid. I will teach you not to be. He reached for one of the thick wool blankets folded nearby and stood. He walked to her, and she flinched again, her fear still a living thing, but he did not try to touch her. He simply unfolded the blanket and gently draped it around her trembling shoulders, his fingers brushing her arms for only a second. Tonight, he said, his voice a solemn vow, you will sleep, and you will not be afraid. I am your husband. My heart is your shield. That shield protects you even from me. He returned to his side of the fire, leaving her wrapped in the warmth of the blanket and the even greater warmth of his words. He banked the fire until it was a bed of soft, glowing coals, and then he lay down on the sheepskins on his side of the hogan, turning his back to her to give her the privacy of the entire room. Clara May sat for a long time, clutching the blanket, the tears finally falling, silent and cleansing. They were not tears of fear, but of overwhelming relief and a love so profound it felt as vast as the desert night. The wedding night was not an ending, but a beginning. It was not a consummation of flesh, but a consummation of trust, in his restraint, in his honor. Nalnish had given her a gift far greater than passion. He had given her patience. He had given her safety. He had claimed her as his wife, and in doing so, had set her free. The days that followed their wedding night were a season of quiet discovery. In the sanctuary of the Hogan, shielded from the harsh judgments of the outside world, a fragile, beautiful intimacy began to bloom. Nalnish kept his vow. He did not press her. Instead, he courted her spirit anew, teaching her the dine words for the stars that wheeled overhead, sharing stories of the coyote trickster by the fire, and showing her a tenderness that she drank in like a parched woman finding a spring. And Clara May, freed from the prison of her fear, began to open like a night-blooming flower, her laughter slowly filling the small, round home, her touch becoming confident and seeking as she learned the new and wondrous language of love at his patient, reverent pace. Their life was a circle, like the Hogan itself, contained and complete, its center the warm glow of the fire. But a circle can also be a target. Theirs was a peace too profound to go unchallenged by the world outside. The news of their union, carried from the wedding site by the trader Abernathy and Reverend Miller, spread through the dusty streets of San Miguel like a grass fire. The story was twisted in the telling. Clara May was no longer a woman who had made a choice, but a poor, captured creature, a white dove in a savage's cage. Reverend Miller spoke from his makeshift pulpit of a soul lost to heathenism, his words fanning the flames of fear and self-righteousness. Women who had once given Clara May polite nods now whispered behind their hands as her father, Jedediah, bought his supplies, his face a permanent mask of pained endurance. The men, their prejudices fueled by cheap whiskey and the inherent hardships of frontier life, spoke more bluntly. They saw Nalnish's marriage to a white woman not as a union of two hearts, but as an act of insolence, a claim on something that was not his to take. A hard-bitten rancher named Silas Croft, a man whose ambition was as vast as the lands he coveted, became the loudest voice. "It ain't right," he'd declare to the men gathered in the saloon. "Let one of 'em take one of our women, and next they'll be thinking they have a right to our land, our water. It's a challenge, and a challenge has to be met." The poison seeped outward. A Navajo family coming to trade found Abernathy's prices suddenly doubled. A trap line Nalnish had maintained for years was smashed, the animals stolen. These were small, spiteful acts, the sparks that fly before the blaze. The discontent was not confined to the settlers. In the Navajo camps, Kia's jealousy festered into open criticism. He saw Nalnish spending his days teaching his white wife the ways of the desert instead of hunting with the other warriors. He saw the respect Nalnish afforded her, a respect that, in Kia's eyes, bordered on servitude. "He softens," Kia would say to the other young men. "The white woman makes his spirit weak. He thinks of her comforts before the needs of the clan. He forgets that her people are the ones who shrink our world with every season." He spoke to their pride and to their fear, and some began to listen. Nalnish, who had always been a leader, began to feel the chill of isolation from his own people. He was a mountain, as he had promised Clara May, but he was now a mountain that stood alone, caught in a crosswind between two gathering storms. The breaking point arrived on a hot, merciless afternoon. Nalnish had gone to check the distant traps that remained, a journey that would take him until dusk. Clara May was inside the Hogan, grinding corn, the rhythmic sound of the stone a comfort in the silence. Their new life had given her a sense of peace, but it had also honed her senses. She heard the horses before she saw them, the sound wrong, too many, their hoofbeats heavy and aggressive, not the light, practiced tread of the dine. She rose and stepped outside. her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. 4 riders were approaching, their figures wavering in the heat rising from the baked earth. They were white men, and they were armed with rifles. Silas Croft was in the lead, his face set in a grim mask of purpose. With him were 3 other ranchers, their expressions a mixture of grim determination and nervous excitement. They reined in their horses a few yards from the hogan, creating a dusty, menacing semicircle. They did not dismount. "Afternoon, ma'am," Silas said, though his tone held no courtesy. His eyes swept over her, taking in her simple dine-style tunic and the way her hair was tied back with a leather cord. He looked around at the clean, orderly space, the rack of drying herbs, the neatly stacked firewood. His lip curled in a slight sneer. "We've come for you." Clara May's fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her wedding vows echoed in her mind. Asterisk, my heart is your shield. She knew, in that moment, that the shield had to protect him, too. She lifted her chin, her gaze steady. "I don't know what you mean. This is my home." "This is no home for a Christian woman," another of the men spat. "It's a sty. We've come to take you back to your own kind." My kind Clara May's voice was quiet, but it was as sharp and clear as a shard of obsidian. My kind are people who show respect, who do not come to a woman's home with rifles and threats. You are not my kind. Silas Croft's face hardened. He had expected tears, pleading, a grateful rescue. This calm defiance infuriated him. "Listen to me, girl. Your father is worried sick. The whole town is... You've been here for weeks. Lord knows what that savage has done to you, what heathen notions he's put in your head. We're here to save you from your own foolishness." He made a move to dismount, and Clara May took a step forward, her body instinctively blocking the entrance to the hogan. It was all she had, this small, round house, and she would defend it with her life. "You will not enter my home," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned them into silence. The terror was still there, a wild bird beating its wings against her ribs, but it was caged now by her love, by her absolute conviction. "My father knows I am safe. I am not a prisoner here. I am a wife." She looked at each of them in turn, her blue eyes blazing with a fire they had never seen in a woman. "My husband is a man of honor, something you clearly know nothing about. He has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. You see a savage. I see the man I love, the man who saved my life." She straightened to her full height, her small frame seeming to possess an impossible strength. The final words were not a plea, but an unbreakable declaration of her identity, a final severing of her ties to their world of prejudice and fear. "I am his wife. No one has the right to separate us." A tense, ugly silence followed. The men shifted in their saddles, thrown off balance by her fierce defense. This was not going as they had planned. Silas's face was dark with rage and humiliation. He was about to speak, to order his men to take her by force, when a new sound reached them. It was the soft, almost inaudible tread of a single horse, ridden with purpose. Nalnish appeared at the edge of the clearing. He was not riding fast, but he moved with a lethal grace that made the air crackle. He held his longbow in one hand, an arrow already knocked on the string. He brought his horse to a halt beside the hogan, a silent, deadly shadow that had materialized from the landscape itself. He did not look at the ranchers. His eyes were fixed on Clara May, taking in her defiant stance, the fire in her eyes, the way she stood as the guardian of their home. A fierce, powerful pride swelled in his chest, so intense it was almost painful. She was the river, and she was magnificent. He then turned his gaze on the 4 men. It was a look devoid of heat, as cold and final as a winter night. He did not need to speak. His presence was a promise of violence so swift and absolute that it was more terrifying than any threat. The ranchers, who had been so bold moments before, now felt the cold touch of real fear. They were 4 men with rifles, but they knew they were facing a man who was part of the land itself, a warrior whose reputation was forged in blood and survival. Silas Croft was the first to break, his bluster evaporating under that silent, deadly stare. He gathered his reins, his face a mottled red. "This ain't over," he snarled, the words empty and weak. He wheeled his horse around and spurted into a gallop, the other three scrambling to follow. Kicking up a cloud of dust that choked the air, they fled, not as rescuers, but as routed intruders. Their righteous crusade shattered against the rock of a woman's will and a warrior's promise. Nalnish remained on his horse until the sound of their hoofbeats faded completely. Then he dismounted, let the arrow rest, and walked to where Clara May still stood. Trembling now that the danger had passed, he did not speak. He simply stood before her, his eyes filled with a love and an awe that was deeper than anything they had yet shared. He raised a hand and gently cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. She had been his shield. They both knew, as they stood together in the ringing silence of the desert, that this was not an ending. It was a beginning. The settlers would go back and tell their story, a story of a defiant, bewitched woman and a threatening savage. The Navajo would hear of how the white men had come to a warrior's home. The sparks of hatred had been fanned into a low, burning fire, and the line between their two worlds had just been drawn in the dust, a line that would soon have to be defended with more than just words. The quiet that followed the rancher's retreat was not peace, but the held breath before a thunderclap. Nalnish moved with a new, coiled tension, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading signs in the dust that Clara May could not yet decipher. He spent hours with her, not on lessons of survival, but on drills of defense. He made her practice with the bow until her fingers were raw, not to make her a hunter, but a protector. He showed her how to bar the hogan door from the inside and where to find the hidden caches of water and dried meat he had stored nearby. He was preparing his home for a siege, and his wife for a war. "You are the heart of this hogan, Clara May," he told her one evening, his voice low and serious as they sat by the fire. "If the walls should fall, the heart must be protected. You must run. Do not fight for the home. Fight for the life within it, your life." She listened, her own heart aching with a cold dread. The idyllic circle of their life had been broken, and the wolves were gathering. The wolves were making their own unholy pact. Silas Croft, his pride festering like a poisoned wound, rode not back to San Miguel, but into the shadowy canyons where men of his own kind feared to tread. He sought out the remnants of the bandit gang that had first attacked Clara May's wagon. He found them, leaderless and hungry, and offered them a deal coin, supplies, and the satisfaction of revenge on the Navajo warrior who had humiliated them. To this volatile mix, he sought to add an insider. Through a series of discreet, dangerous meetings with those Navajo disgruntled with Nalnish, he sent a message to Kea. The offer was simple: help them ambush Nalnish, and Kea would be seen as the one who purged the clan of a weakening influence. The white woman would be rescued and returned to her people, and Kea's own standing as a warrior would rise. Kea, blinded by jealousy and a twisted sense of honor, agreed. He saw it not as a betrayal of his kin, but as a painful necessity to restore the strength of the Daine. He would not kill Nalnish himself, but he would ensure that he was there, and that he was vulnerable. The attack came on the third day, as the sun began to bleed its color into the western sky. Kea had ridden to the hogan earlier, a gesture of false reconciliation. He spoke of a mountain lion that had been seen near the northern ridges and proposed they hunt it together, a chance for them to be warriors side by side again. Nalnish, though wary, could not refuse without causing a deep, public rift. It was a challenge to his honor he had to accept. He told Clara May he would be back by full dark, and she watched him ride away with his cousin, a knot of ice tightening in her stomach. She knew, with a woman's intuition that defied all logic, that it was a trap. The ambush was laid in a narrow pass, a place of jagged rocks and deep shadows. Nalnish sensed it a second too late. As they entered the pass, Kea reined in his horse. A signal. The crack of a rifle echoed from the rocks above, the bullet tearing through the muscle of Nalnish's shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. He landed hard, his head striking a rock, dazing him. Before he could recover, they were on him. The bandits, their faces contorted with hatred, and Silas Croft, his eyes gleaming with triumphant malice. Nalnish fought with the fury of a cornered lion. Even injured and outnumbered, he was a whirlwind of lethal motion. He broke one man's arm with his bare hands, sent another staggering back with a knife drawn from his boot, but it was too much. A second shot grazed his thigh, and as he stumbled, one of the bandits drove a knife deep into his side. A grunt of pure agony was torn from him, and he fell to his knees, the world dissolving into a red-tinged haze. Silas Croft stood over him, his rifle aimed at Nalnish's head, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Not so proud now, are you, Injun?" At the Hogan, Clara May had heard the first distant rifle shot. The sound had pierced her heart. She didn't hesitate. All of Nalnish's warnings, all her own fears, coalesced into a single, clarifying purpose. She would not run. The heart of the Hogan would not flee while its shield was broken. She grabbed her father's old rifle, the one Nalnish had taken from the bandits and kept in their home. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely load it, the cartridges fumbling through her fingers. She checked the powder, her mind a strange, cold calm in the center of her terror. She was no longer Clara May Thompson, the carpenter's daughter from Ohio. She was Nalnish's wife, and her husband was in danger. She ran, her feet flying over the familiar ground, the heavy rifle awkward in her arms. She followed the direction of the sound, her breath tearing in her lungs, her every instinct screaming. As she neared the pass, she heard Croft's triumphant voice. She slowed, creeping forward, using the cover of the rocks as Nalnish had taught her. She peered around a boulder and the scene below burned itself into her soul. Nalnish, her husband, her mountain, was on his knees, his lifeblood staining the red sand. Kea stood apart, his face a mask of conflict, his betrayal complete, and Silas Croft was about to end the life of the man she loved. Time seemed to slow. There was no thought, only instinct. She raised the rifle. The barrel was heavy, shaking in her grasp. She had never fired it before. She rested it on the boulder to steady her aim, just as she had done with the bow countless times. She looked down the long barrel, centered the sight on the one thing she wanted to erase from the world, Croft's smug, hateful back. She closed her eyes and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's kick was a brutal, shocking force, slamming her back against the rock. The explosion was deafening. When she opened her eyes, Croft was on the ground, screaming, clutching a shattered shoulder. Her shot had been wild, but it had been true enough. The world erupted into chaos. The bandits, stunned by the shot from an unseen attacker, momentarily forgot Nalnish. Kea looked up at the rocks, his eyes wide with disbelief as he saw Clara May standing there, smoke curling from the rifle barrel, her face a pale, determined mask. In that moment of distraction, Nalnish surged. With a last desperate roar of strength, he launched himself at the bandit closest to him, driving his knife home. As that man fell, Nalnish collapsed, his strength finally spent. Clara May didn't wait. She scrambled down the rocks, loading another cartridge as she ran. The remaining bandits, their leader wounded and their surprise gone, saw her coming. This was not the frightened girl they had imagined. This was a she-wolf defending her mate. Their nerve broke. They grabbed the screaming Silas Croft, hauled him onto a horse, and fled into the deepening twilight. Kea remained, frozen, caught between his two worlds. He looked at the wounded Nalnish, then at the approaching Clara May, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. He could not face her. With a cry of shame and anguish, he leaped onto his horse and galloped away, a traitor to both sides. belonging nowhere. Clara May fell to her knees beside Nalnish. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his body a canvas of terrible wounds. The sand around him was dark with his blood. For a moment, paralyzing grief seized her. He was gone, but then she felt the faint, fluttery pulse at his neck. He was alive. The warrior was born. She tore strips from her own dress, her hands moving with a desperate, focused speed. She packed the deep knife wound in his side, pressing down with all her might to staunch the bleeding, her own tears mixing with the blood on her hands. The gunshot in his shoulder was a mangled mess. She could do nothing for that here. She had to move him. He was a dead weight, far too heavy for her to lift, but she would not leave him. She looped her arms under his shoulders and began to drag him, inch by painful inch, back toward the hogan. Every rock, every root, was an enemy. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned. She fell. She rose. She pulled again, her progress a slow, bloody trail in the dust. She was no longer thinking, only moving, fueled by a love so fierce it gave her supernatural strength. It took an eternity. When she finally dragged him over the threshold of their home, she collapsed, her body spent, but she could not rest. She barred the door, then turned to her husband. In the dim light of the dying fire, she saw the true extent of his injuries. Death was a cold shadow in the room, waiting patiently. And Clara May went to war with it. She cleaned his wounds with the last of their clean water. She remembered the leaves he had shown her, the ones that fought infection, and she crushed them into a poultice, her hands stained green and red. She stitched the gash in his side with her sewing needle and fine thread, her stitches small and neat, her focus absolute. She forced water between his lips. She bathed his feverish head. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, help arrived. Alerted by the fleeing Kia's panicked, guilt-ridden confession, Nalnish's mother and Hostine Yazzie appeared at the door. When Clara May let them in, they stopped, silenced by the scene before them. Their hogan was a field hospital. Their proud warrior lay near death, and this white woman, this outsider they had feared and resented, was covered in his blood, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. She had not run. She had fought. She had dragged her husband home and was now fighting for his very soul. In that moment, the blood that had been spilled on the sand outside began to work its strange, terrible magic. It was a symbol not of division, but of a shared, brutal sacrifice. Nalnish's mother knelt beside Clara May, no longer seeing a white woman, but a daughter, a warrior in her own right. She placed a hand on Clara May's trembling shoulder, and together, the two women, from two different worlds, continued the fight for the life of the man they both loved. Nalnish hovered in the gray lands between life and death for 3 days and 3 nights. It was a time outside of time, measured not by the sun and moon, but by the rhythm of his shallow breaths, in the small, smoke-filled hogan. Clara did not sleep. She existed in a state of hypervigilance, her world shrinking to the man on the sheepskins, the smell of herbs and blood, and the comforting, steady presence of his mother, Astza. They worked together in a seamless, silent language of shared purpose. Astza, whose hands held the wisdom of generations, knew the ancient chants to call a spirit back from the edge of the void. Clara, whose hands held the fierce, stubborn grip of a love that would not let go, knew how to clean and bind, how to spoon broth and water between his cracked lips, how to fight the fever with cool, damp cloths. The boundary between their two worlds dissolved in the face of their shared vigil. They were no longer settler and Navajo. They were two women fighting for their son, their husband. Jedediah came on the second day, his face a wreck of terror and awe. He had heard the news in San Miguel, a tale of a bloody fight, of his daughter taking up a rifle. He found not the captive girl of the town's rumors, but a woman he barely recognized. Her dress was torn and blood-stained, Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes held a commander's authority. She was the heart of this small fortress, and she was holding the line. He brought what he could: clean bandages, medicine from the trader, and then retreated, knowing with a painful certainty that his daughter no longer needed his protection. She had found her own. On the morning of the fourth day, Nalnish's fever broke. He woke slowly, his mind struggling up from a deep, dark well. The first thing he saw was Clara's face, hovering over him like a weary angel. Her hair was a wild halo in the morning light slanting through the smoke hole, and the lines of exhaustion around her eyes only made her more beautiful. He tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. She saw the flicker of consciousness in his eyes, and a sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her. She pressed a cup of water to his lips. Nalnish. She whispered his name, and the sound was a prayer. His recovery was a slow, arduous journey back to the light. Every day, he grew a little stronger, and every day, he watched his wife. He saw her competence, her tireless care, the gentle but firm way she directed his own mother in preparing his food and medicines. He saw the easy respect that now existed between the two women. He saw the warrior who had been born in the crucible of his near death. The innocent, fearful girl he had married was gone, and in her place was a woman forged of fire and love, as strong and resilient as the desert itself. His love for her, which had begun as a vow of protection for a fragile, spirited creature, transformed. It deepened, expanded, and settled into something far more profound. It was the love of equals, a partnership of two spirits who had been tested by blood and had emerged, together, unbreakable. He had promised to be her mountain, her shield, but she had been his. She had been the river that had refused to let the mountain fall. News from the outside world trickled in. Silas Croft had survived, but his shoulder was ruined, his shooting arm useless. He had lost more than that. He had lost his authority. The men who followed him had been routed not by a warrior, but by a lone woman with a rifle. His crusade had ended in humiliation. Kia's fate was a sadder one. He had returned to the clan and confessed his betrayal. His shame so great he could not meet anyone's eyes. He was not killed. He was exiled, cast out to wander the wilderness alone, a man without a people, haunted by the ghost of his own jealousy. The blood that had been shed had bought not victory or glory, but only loss and shame for those who had let hatred rule their hearts. When Nalnish could finally walk, leaning heavily on a staff and on Clara's shoulder, they stepped out of the hogan and into the bright, clean sunlight. The world felt new, reborn. They stood for a long time, just breathing the air, their hands clasped. "This place," Nalnish said, his voice still raspy, looking at the hogan that had been their sanctuary and their hospital. "It holds too much shadow now." Clara knew he was right. They could not build a future on a foundation stained with such a violent memory. "Where will we go?" she asked. He looked east, toward the distant, hazy line of the settlers' world, and then west, toward the heart of Dinetta. "We will walk the path between," he said. They found a small, abandoned adobe cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwoods by a creek, on a piece of land that belonged to neither world. It was on the very edge of the desert, close enough for Nalnish to see his family, yet near enough that Jedediah could visit without making a long, arduous journey. It was a place of balance, a bridge. They rebuilt it together. Jedediah, his heart slowly mending as he saw his daughter's true happiness, came and helped them mend the roof and fashion a sturdy door. Nalnish, his strength returning day by day, taught Clara how to mix the adobe mud with straw, and she laughed as they covered each other in the thick, wet earth. His mother brought them blankets and clay pots, and showed Clara how to build an outdoor oven, a *horno*, where she could bake her bread. Their new home was a melding of their two lives. Inside, A proper bed frame built by Jedediah stood near a traditional Navajo loom that Astza had given to Clara. Clay pots filled with desert herbs sat on shelves next to tin plates and coffee cups. It was a place that was uniquely theirs, a testament to a love that had refused to be defined by borders. Clara was no longer a girl. She was a woman. Her heart filled not with fear, but with a deep, quiet strength and an infinite capacity for love. She moved with a purpose and grace that came from knowing who she was and where she belonged. She belonged here, at this man's side. One evening, as the first chill of autumn sharpened the air, they sat outside their new home, watching the sky burn with the colors of the sunset. The land was quiet, at peace.
Do you ever miss your old life? Nalnish asked,
his voice soft. Clara thought of the green hills of Ohio, of the life she had once imagined for herself. It felt like a story about someone else, a pale, faded photograph. I miss my mother, she said honestly, but my life did not begin until I came here, until I met you. He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. He looked at their joined hands, one dark, calloused, and scarred, the other fair, slender, but no longer soft, strengthened by work and hardship. When I first saw you, he said, his gaze distant, remembering, I saw a spirit that the desert could not break. I made a vow to protect that spirit. He turned to her, his eyes full of a love that was as vast and endless as the sky above them. I was a fool, a proud fool. I thought my love was a shield to hold in front of you. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. Your spirit needs no shield. Clara May, it is a fire. My love is only the wood that I will feed it for the rest of our days. They dreamed, then, of the future, of children who would have her blue eyes and his black hair, children who would know the songs of the Dine and the hymns of the settlers, who would speak two languages, who would be a bridge of flesh and blood between two peoples, a new generation, born not of conflict, but of a love that had been tested by fire. He stood, pulling her to her feet to stand before him. The first stars were appearing in the twilight sky. He took both of her hands in his. At our wedding, I made a vow, he said, his voice a low, sacred murmur. He repeated the words he had spoken in the rock alcove, but they held a new, deeper meaning now. I swear to protect you as I protect the Mother Earth. I swear to honor you as I honor the spirits of my ancestors. He paused, and his grip on her hands tightened. He was not just repeating the old words, he was forging a new promise, a new truth that had been earned through their shared sacrifice. But more than this, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, I swear to walk beside you, not before you. You are the river, and you are the mountain. You are my heart, and my life is yours, to walk in beauty, until our spirits are called home to the stars. They stood in the gathering dark, their foreheads touching, the wind carrying his renewed vow out into the vast, silent desert. The final image of their struggle was not of blood on the sand, but of this quiet, unbreakable peace. It was the image of a dawn, a brilliant, red-gold sunrise breaking over the horizon, illuminating their small home, their bridge between worlds. Clara and Nalni stood hand in hand, watching it together, their figures silhouetted against the morning light. Their love, a silent promise that became one with the wind and the dust, eternal and undying. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, and like this video. You can also give us extra support by hitting the hype button, which helps this story reach even more listeners.